Joining me now from New York is Andrij Dobriansky. He's a Ukrainian-American political and cultural analyst. In Moscow, we have Andrie Frolov. He's a researcher at the Center for Analysis, Strategies and Technologies. And from London is James Sherr. He's an associate fellow for the Russia and Eurasia program at Chatham House. Gentlemen, thank you very much for joining us. Andrij Frolov, let me begin with you. So Russia fired on and then seized those 3 Ukrainian ships. Was it justified?
From the Russian point of view, it's certainly justified because Crimea is a part of Russian territory with territorial waters around it 12 miles. So from the Russian point of view, everything was okay, and from the Russian point of view, it was Ukrainian part who acted very boldly and very aggressively and tried to go into Azov Sea without any permission. But we have to remind and keep in mind that before all Ukrainian warship asked for kind of permission to go into Azov Sea, and we didn't see any problems of getting such kind of permission from Russian side.
Andrij Dobriansky, the Russians see this as a blatant provocation from the Ukrainians, and they felt that they needed to take action. That's clearly how they see it, but you do not agree. Tell me why.
That's the only part of this entire conversation that nobody believes. It's only Russia who is putting this false equivalency on. It was a Ukrainian naval vessel leaving a Ukrainian naval port, traveling through Ukrainian waters towards a Ukrainian destination. There was no reason for them to be attacked unprovoked. As far as getting permission to travel through waters that are Ukrainian, Ukraine actually did send information hours ahead of the transit as normally. So either Russia is saying that there is no possibility for any ships to transverse through the Azov Sea, that being they now claim the Azov Sea as their own territorial water, including the Kerch Strait, or it is a transit way for international boatways. You can't have it both ways.
James Sherr, is it clear to you who caused it?
I think Russia caused it with premeditation. I also think Ukraine should have anticipated it because of a wider context that I hope we will discuss. But I'd ask you to bear 3 points in mind. First, only the Russian Federation and a very small number of states recognize the annexation of Crimea, and hence Russian claim over these waters as lawful. Secondly, the 2003 bilateral treaty between Russia and Ukraine designates the Sea of Azov as a shared waterway. According to that treaty, Ukraine needs no permission for egress or exit from that waterway. It was Russia unilaterally in 2015 that imposed this requirement, which is not recognized by anyone. The clear Russian anxiety, it's obvious from the transcripts and the tapes that have been released, is that although the ships were actually intercepted in waters that Russia recognizes as international waters, they were obviously headed towards the Kerch Strait and waters that Russia recognizes as its own.
And that's interesting. And as we speak about that wider context, Andrij Frolov, the reality being, even though Russia considers Crimea theirs, yes, that's fine. You can consider it yours, but your only friends in this are Cuba and Nicaragua and Syria and North Korea and a couple of others. The entire international community does not accept that, and the Ukrainians didn't even need to ask for permission. Isn't that fair?
Yes, this is a real legal problem because from the Russian point of view, everything is okay, and from international point of view, nothing is okay. So it was a question of time of such kind of collisions between Ukraine and Russia, and it's ridiculously that it took place 3 years after Crimea became a Russian part. So I think such kind of collisions maybe take place in the future, but now I think both sides have to do its best in order to intimidate and in order to go to pacification of the collisions. And I think maybe in months to come, Russia will release both Marines, sailors and boats.
Right, and Mr. Frolov, we're seeing no such measures at pacification, as you put it. I was looking at some pictures on RT earlier on of these missiles heading towards that region, the Kerch region, right? S-400s and others. So even though the Russians have been fighting the Ukrainians by other means over the past few years, by supporting pro-Russia separatists in the east, is Russia preparing for a proper full-blown war with the Ukrainians right now?
I don't think so, because Russia doesn't need to go into the war with Ukraine now. And Russia always said that it doesn't need any war and doesn't need any conflict with Ukraine. So I don't think such scenario. So in Russia, because I'm Russian, so there is a very fierce estimate that latest collision was in interest of Poroshenko, and we can see that such kind of collision took place some days before G20 meeting. So I don't think Russia needs some kind of, collision and right. State of war with Ukraine now.
Okay, so help me understand this. Before I go to Mr. Dobriansky, help me understand this. Hold on, Andrij Dobriansky. So Andrie Frolov, just to be absolutely clear, there's a view in Russia that Poroshenko cooked this up or created this. Is that what you mean?
I don't mean, in Russia there are some, observations regarding the story, and one of them is that it was a kind of internal fight in Ukrainian elites, and some of people are now trying to weaken Poroshenko, because such kind of crisis finally hit Poroshenko, because he was put into a very ambiguous situation, and he had to declare this martial law state in Ukraine before the election. So possibly it was kind of provocation inside of Ukrainian elites. Okay. Some parts of it was trying to intimidate Russia.
Okay, so Andrij Dobriansky, that was also echoed by the Russian deputy UN ambassador Dmitry Polyansky. They believe Poroshenko is doing a sort of wag the dog here because of elections. That's what it's about. What do you think?
Well, trusting Russia is like reading The Onion or any other satire. None of it is based on reality. But I really need to push back on this word collision. These boats were rammed perpendicularly. This is not two cars coming to an intersection. This was a ramming of unarmed boats. And then we have video and pictures of them being fired on. So if they're fired on and a hole the size of a cantaloupe is in one of the Ukrainian naval vessels, that's not a collision, that's an attack on sovereign vessels in Ukrainian territory. This is a military attack. This is a form of war.
Andrei Frolov?
I don't think it's a kind of war, because if we see on the history of such kind of border collision between different countries, a ramming is not a kind of act of war. And moreover, if Russia really wanted to fight Ukrainian boats, we can see more than one hit in Ukrainian boat, and moreover, there is no dead people among the crew. So I don't think it was a war between Russia and Ukraine boats.
Okay, James Sherr, let me bring you in here and sort of broaden it out again, because all eyes on the Americans initially to see how they would respond to this. Nikki Haley, the outgoing U.S. ambassador to the UN, condemning the move, taking the side of the Ukrainians, calling it Russian aggression. U.S. Secretary of State Mike Pompeo also calling it a dangerous escalation and a violation of international law. And even Donald Trump saying, well, maybe I won't meet with Putin because we don't like aggression, and this was clearly Russian aggression. Are you surprised by the fact that the Trump administration is saying, yeah, the Ukrainians are the victim here and Russia is the aggressor?
Just one important point. I think Russia has to decide what its story is and stick to it. Andrei Frolov began by saying that Poroshenko engineered this for his own domestic advantage, and then ended by saying that this is a conspiracy caused by people in Ukraine who are setting out to weaken Poroshenko, so both cannot be true. There are several consequences here, and I don't think they are what Russia has expected. The strong U.S. reaction is certainly something they expected. The reaction from the EU, more or less, is what they expected. The international reaction is what Russia's expected. But Russia is trying to make a point. They're perfectly clear nobody recognizes Crimea's annexation, but they're trying to show the world, and this is not the only occasion, that this is the way it is. This is Russia's view. These are Russia's interests. You can like it or dislike it. We are going to defend our interests by whatever means necessary, very ruthlessly, and you can't do anything about it. And when you finally realize you can't do anything about it, then you'll come to the table and talk to us on a different basis. The immediate consequences, of course, are a lot of table pounding. But what is the West actually doing? We don't know. Maybe something will be done that Russia will pay attention to, but nothing yet. The consequences in Ukraine are more interesting because I think one of the reasons for this was to provoke President Poroshenko into declaring a harder, more strict, extreme version of martial law than he has, suspend democratic rights, suspend the elections, and that quite reasonably could be expected to cause an internal dissatisfaction in Ukraine, bring people onto the streets, and that would be very beneficial to Poroshenko's main appointment, Yulia Tymoshenko, who is already for some time imposing as the defender of Ukrainian democracy and the peacemaker.
Okay, so Andrij Dobriansky, whether he's thought this through fully or not, by declaring martial law, is Poroshenko playing into the hands of his opponents, and is he invariably, inadvertently strengthening the Russians?
Well, the president, with the assent of Parliament, Parliament passed this law in 2015, so they fully understand the law that was passed, has put 10 borderline areas into a state of readiness. There's no martial law in terms of taking over any local legislative bodies. There's no military marching through the streets. It is a state of preparedness. And it also, most importantly, has a sunset clause of 30 days. I'd just like to pair that with the declaration of emergency that France went into for 2 years after terrorist attacks happened there. This is much more different in terms of Ukraine has actively been invaded for 4 years. A space of land the size of Belgium has been occupied within its territory. And what Ukraine is doing is simply making sure that its border areas are ready for any other kind of Russian encroachment. I think that's very sensible. Again, comparing the state of France, which laid in state of emergency with heightened military and armed personnel throughout its major cities for 2 years. This is a completely rational response from the president of Ukraine.
So, James Sherr, Andrij Dobriansky is saying, well, Poroshenko's not quite taking the bait. He has to do this. It's just, these are just necessary measures responding adequately.
Well, I think he hasn't taken the bait. We could have a separate discussion, hopefully a balanced discussion with pros and cons about what martial law, the state of preparedness, is really meant to accomplish and whether it will accomplish it. Obviously, from the domestic point of view, if these actions in the Black Sea, mainly outside the Sea of Azov, were designed as a prelude to some greater escalation, and martial law was not declared, and again, there was no preparedness taken, then obviously the president would be under extreme criticism. Don't forget the legacy of Crimea, which was taken over by stealth without resistance. Again, why that was the case is a complex matter, but there is there's an understandable sensitivity and nervousness here, on top of which every Ukrainian knows by now that Russia can be expected to act in asymmetrical ways, unprecedented ways, and without warning. So they expect the unexpected from this particular neighbor and adversary.
Right. Andrie Frolov, I've been following a lot of the Russian media in the English language over the past 24 hours. And for me, what's interesting is that this is not necessarily seen as Russia versus Ukraine, but it's quite clearly framed as Russia versus the West, Russia versus NATO. Ukraine's not a member of NATO. But tell me why the Russians see Ukraine as the front lines of their battle against the West and NATO. Tell me why.
First of all, I don't think that Russian media really shadows that conflict at that way as you have described. But anyway, the problem is that Ukraine, during its independence, wanted to adhere NATO, and from the Russian point of view, this is one of the main threats to the Russian security. So that's why Russia always had do its best in order to prevent Ukraine to go into NATO. And we can see that with current disputes regarding Crimea and East Ukraine, I think it's impossible from the formal point of view to Ukraine to go into NATO in the years to come. So from the Russian point of view, the bid is done, and Ukraine is now is forbidden formally to go into NATO. But coming back to this Kerch Strait maritime battle, I don't think this is a battle between NATO and Russia.
Again,
from the Russian side,
let me qualify that and clarify that. In every single article that I come across, folded into it is this idea that the West is antagonizing, that the Ukraine is pro-West, that the West is trying to use Ukraine as a way of, at the very least, annoying Russia, and at the very worst, trying to actively attack Russia. So again, I'm extracting that and I'm asking you why, right? I don't know why, and I'm asking you why.
I think this is just a kind of remake of publication we saw during 2014 and 2013 with events in Ukraine. So in Russia, some of experts and some of journalists believe that it was inspired by the West, and what we have after it, it was just kind of continued policy of the West in order to make Ukraine anti-Russian and make Ukraine a part of NATO. I don't know, maybe a part of European Union and so on. So this is a kind of explanation of previous events, and from that point of view, it's very logical.
Okay. Andrij Dobriansky, is Minsk under threat? Minsk is hardly holding very well, but is it even more gravely under threat now?
Well, many of the basic tenets of the Minsk Agreement have been broken by Russia numerous times, not least of which is these increasing attacks against Ukraine. Not only are they dismissing the pretense of using these men without insignia in Ukraine, but now openly they are having their own military personnel with Russian insignia on Russian ships. And I must stress that this is not a military battle in the Kerch Strait. This was a ramming of unarmed ships, Ukrainian ships leaving a Ukrainian port, traveling through Ukrainian waters towards a Ukrainian destination. This is an open military attack, the likes of which is completely against any kind of international convention. I would really like to see, if Russia is so scared of NATO, what NATO could possibly do is, in the name of goodwill, some NATO member states could possibly have some humanitarian missions go into the Azov Sea. Maybe that will convince Russia, with some NATO ships inside the NATO Sea, to give help to those areas of Ukraine that are under constant bombardment. They can deliver some humanitarian aid. I think if Russia is seriously concerned about the humanitarian situation, they would probably accede to that.
Okay, James Sherr, Minsk, and all the developments, all the positive developments. We heard from the OSCE and others that there have been some positive developments in terms of ceasefire in the east of Ukraine. Is that under threat?
Look, Minsk Accords are irrelevant. The Minsk Accords say absolutely nothing about the Black Sea or naval armament. This has been one of its major deficiencies. Technically, Russia could mount an amphibious invasion of Mariupol without literally being in violation of Minsk. It would be like telling someone not to kick the chair, and so they kick the table instead. So Minsk should not be part of this discussion. The underlying problem here, and it's the underlying problem of the war and before the war, which has been taking place since 2014, is that Russia is just the Russians collectively and the Russian leadership collectively is temperamentally unable to regard Ukraine as the key actor in its own drama. I hardly know a single serious analyst in Russia who does not believe that this is a war against the West taking place inside Ukraine the Russian leadership has been on record many times as identifying the United States and the EU and the West as the main instigators behind both the Orange Revolution of 2004 and the Euromaidan of 2013. So there's this is part of the wider context here. May I just add that another part of it, which is apparently unrelated, has been the enormous surprise and the enormous blow dealt to Russia by the decision of the Patriarchate in Constantinople to grant what had been the Kiev Patriarchate of the Russian Orthodox Church completely independent canonical status. And Putin's first reaction to this was to convene the Security Council, which make it perfectly clear the Russian state leadership understand this as a security issue and a security threat. And there has been a lot of discussion about the range of matters that need to be taken. So part of what is happening here is a stronger predisposition on Russia's part to provoke and find pretexts for grossly disproportionate reaction to anything Ukraine does. And we have not seen the end of it, in my view.
Okay, we have not seen the end of it. We'll be following it closely, and we'd love to invite you all back onto the program very soon. For the moment, I have to move on. The two Andrijs, Dobriansky and Frolov, and James Sherr, I thank you all for joining us here on the Newsmakers.